Okay, just quickly sending out the link. Okay, just quickly sending out the link. Cool. Just sending out the link quickly for all those who are joining us. My name is Anthony Avice Du Buisson, and today's stream is going to be a bit casual, explain a couple books that really have touched my life and that I find worth reading. So this whole stream is going to be just dedicated to that. There will be questions at the end of it, what you'd like to see. I'm just going to enjoy and books that I find. Freelance writer. I'm South African born, currently live in Australia, and this stream is going to be a bit casual, so don't feel pre-find to be important, that have touched my life, that have had an impact on me, and that I find incredibly. Without further ado, I'm going to just sort of start off on talking about just who the person on the screen is. The person on the screen at the moment, before Miss Satrapy came on, which, if for those of you who don't know who Hannah Arendt is, she was a philosopher who did a big examination not only on Adolf Eichmann, but also on the origins of totalitarianism and the ideology of totalitarianism. I find her book on the origins of totalitarianism to be... So your stream is dead, mate. What do you mean? Hold on a second. What? Stream. That's a bit awkward. Okay, we still got people listening, or has it just like dead? What? Sorry for the awkward little pause here, but apparently the stream just paused for a bit. I've got it back up and running, and everything should be all good to go. So I was just saying, for all of those of you who have just joined me, I'm Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I'm a freelance writer for Areo Magazine, The Region, and Jerusalem Post. I write on the MENA region, especially minority rights and human rights. I also am studying a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws. So this stream is just going to be casual. It's not going to be too intense. I'm going to be talking about some books that I find interesting, that have inspired me and that have allowed me to develop as an individual. And I want to share this stuff with all those who bother to listen to this now and in the future. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them in the last half hour of the stream. So without further ado, I'll get on to it then. And sorry for all those who have been listening for the last 5 minutes if it's been going a bit clunky here and there. It's just technical issues. It usually happens. So anyway, I am going to now just explain to you 5 books that I find were important for my development as a young adult. So for all those of you who don't know, my age is 23. I've read quite a bit of books over my time, even though I'm still young. One of the first books that I ever read actually was by Nelson Mandela. And all those of you who don't know who Nelson Mandela is or was, he was a South African politician and human rights lawyer. He was jailed by the apartheid regime on the false charges of treason for trying to quote-unquote overthrow the government. He was a civil rights activist for the anti-apartheid movement, and he created the party, he was head of the party of the ANC, or the African National Congress. While he served in jail, he served jail time in South Africa for about almost 20 to 30 years. He was released in the 1990, and from there he became South Africa's first democratically elected black president. He wrote a book, actually, which is very interesting that I would advise everyone try to read. It's called Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. Long Walk to Freedom is a retelling, really, of Mandela's life from his own eyes. So it follows his journey from his small Xhosa village in the northeast of South Africa, all the way to his early life studying law and practicing law, to his activism against the apartheid regime, to his jail time by the Afrikaner nationalist regime, and the 20 years he spent in jail, and his reflections over the time that he spent in jail. It was one of the first books I read, and I read it when I was about 11. I picked it up actually off the shelf of my local library when I used to go to Catholic school. I used to spend time in the library looking at Goosebumps books and all sorts of different colourful books, and I found this rather thick book in the corner of the library in the non-fiction section. Being me, I'm kind of curious. I was looking at, if I can recall my memory, I was looking at the old Roman sort of color books, and what Romans used to wear and what Greeks used to wear in the ancient days in their warfare and that. So I was flipping through the pictures and that, and I saw this rather colorful book. It had a green blackish spine, and I was curious. So I opened it up, and I spent the next, I think, about 2 hours. I came back after a while. Like, I came back every couple days, basically, to finish off this book, because it was quite lengthy. But what I find very interesting about the book is Nelson Mandela's perspective towards life and towards his struggles. As a young person myself, dealing with bullying and other emotional kind of inflictions from the external world, I found it quite difficult actually to not hate on people, to not vent my anger towards others. I mean, if anyone has been bullied before, you'll understand the sort of psychological effect it can have on a child's mind and how it can affect a child's behavior as well. If you hear any loud sounds in the background, that's actually stone curlews, because it's 1:20 a.m. in the morning over here, and stone curlews are like these loud birds that have these really quite annoying calls. They're native to Queensland over here. But anyway, back to what I was saying. If you can understand the psychological effect that bullying has on children, then you understand how it can affect your behavior, and how it can make you feel isolated and make you feel almost not self-pitying, but just you don't really like yourself, especially if you're constantly berated by bullies and that. There's actually a very lot of good words that can be found in the book, because the book really embodies a kind of a sort of an outlook towards life of Stoicism. And if all of you who aren't read on what Stoicism is, it's a philosophy whereby you take the position of accepting reality for what it is, and being able to accept all its faults, all its blessings, and acting accordingly to this otherwise beautiful but harsh reality. So it teaches you really how to become prepared, how to learn to control your emotions, to, what is it that Epictetus and even Seneca and Aurelius said? There we go, Marcus Aurelius on the slideshow, that said you have to have control over your faculties. That's basically, for the Stoic, it's very important to have control of your faculties, to not allow yourself to be dragged on by your emotions, either left or right or forward or backwards. You essentially maintain, you've heard the saying, you've got to be stoic. That's sort of, it's almost like having stiff upper lip, as the British would say it. It's this attitude that, yes, the stuff is going to be hard, but I'm going to get through. It's that persistent, determinant attitude. And in Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, it really resonates, especially when he's writing about his time in jail and what he learned about his oppressor. Because what I find very important from the book, and what I learned important lessons from, is his attitude towards those he hated. He had a lot of hate for the Afrikaner, okay? For what the Afrikaner did to him and his people. However, after being decades in prison, he learned how to control that. He learned to say that, okay, if you allow hate to direct you, in other words, you're enslaving yourself to your oppressor. You're chaining your mind up. Because, as he mentions, the oppressor and the oppressed are one and the same. The oppressor, in his nature, wants to oppress the individual and to make dominance over them. And the one that is being oppressed is chained and caged. However, in order to get out of that cage, you have to retake control of your mind. You must retain mental clarity and mental fortitude and the ability to overcome your trials and tribulations. So this is what I found very powerful about Nelson Mandela and about his book Long Walk to Freedom. And there's actually a passage that I'll quote from Nelson Mandela right now from the book A Long Walk to Freedom. So just bear with me for a moment. Thank you for all those of you who are bothering to actually listen to me at this time of the night. As I said before, it's a quasi-casual stream, so don't stress on remembering any topic. I'm just here to try to share some books that I find important, some books that have actually influenced me. Be sure to actually drop a question in the chat box if you have a question for me later. I will be answering questions from Twitter and from Twitter and basically Twitter and the chat later. So okay. So okay, there's a passage actually that I actually find that still resonates with me today, and it's towards the end of the book. It's towards the end of the book, and that's what I found most important. So it goes like this: "It was during those long and lonely years that my hunger for the freedom of my people became a hunger for the freedom of all people, white and black. I knew, as well as I knew anything, that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken away from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. When I walked out of that prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. Some say that has now been achieved, but I know that this is not the case. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." That's from the ending of the book, from Nelson Mandela, A Long Walk to Freedom. I find it important because it did establish this underlying thing that you'll slowly gather from the more you listen to me when I talk to you about other books, of this underlying theme of Stoicism, the ability to have the strength and persistence to weather the storm of life's many, many obstacles. So that book is Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, and it's one book that I would recommend any young person especially, or any person in general, to read at least in your lifetime, because you will find a lot of wisdom, a lot of interesting lessons on how to deal with oppression and how to deal with tyranny and how to deal with the emotions that come with it, and to be able to have the mental fortitude to continue despite all the obstacles thrown against you. Okay, so that's the first book. Now, shifting a bit gears over here, the second book that I want to talk about is by an author that most of you most likely may have not even heard about. His name is Alain de Bouton, and there we go. These are right on the screen there. Alain de Bouton, he is a Swiss-English writer, and I would call him a sort of like the people's philosopher. He wrote a book in 2000 called The Consolations of Philosophy. For me, it was my first introduction to philosophy. He covers, I believe, 6 people in about 6 chapters. He covers Socrates, Epicurus, Seneca, Montaigne, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, I believe. What he does, and what I find very interesting and very helpful about his book, Consolations of Philosophy, is he takes an aspect of each of these philosophers' lives and he translates it into a palpable fashion for the average reader. So prior to this book, I read this book in 2012. I was a bit young. I was told 2012, so I was about 16 when I first read this book. It's a small book. It's a very it's a find it Penguin paperback. You can find it most stores, usually under the philosophy section. I found it by accident, actually, when I was searching for a sort of another book, poetry book by Lord Alfred Tennyson, and I came across this book actually by accident. But along with Status Anxiety, if you know the other books, this book, Consolations of Philosophy, was adapted into a series on YouTube that you can find still on YouTube. It's from 2000. It's about 6 or 7 episodes where he covers different philosophers. And what he does, and what I find incredibly interesting about his writing, about Alain de Bouton's writing, is he breaks down the complex ideas and he takes a cradle of that philosopher's life and the philosophy that they practiced and translates it into a way that is very susceptible to non-philosophers and average readers. For example, for chapter 1, he has Socrates, basically. Socrates on public opinion. He has Epicurus on happiness. He has Schopenhauer on suffering and struggle. And I just want to sort of pay close attention to the last chapter of the book, which is, of course, Friedrich Nietzsche's on suffering and what... hello, everyone. By the way, please be sure to drop down a comment. I'm just going through the books that I enjoy. Okay, so be free to leave a question as well while you're listening. I'm just going through the books that I find important for myself. It's a casual stream, so we'll go by ear, really, when it comes to this. So just chill, relax. But anyway, so when it comes to Consolations of Philosophy, there's a last chapter that focuses mainly on Friedrich Nietzsche, and it focuses on one aspect of his life, mostly on suffering, and how Friedrich Nietzsche dealt with suffering. This was my first introduction to Friedrich Nietzsche as a young man. I should say as a young teen, really. In the chapter, Alain de Bouton goes through the life of Nietzsche. He goes through his upbringing, his abusive father, the death of his sibling, I should say, his lack of ability to fit in, his very sadly tragic life that he had. It goes through the story of his life, and it goes through his attitude towards suffering, because Nietzsche suffered a lot from the world. He suffered from people who did not understand him. He suffered because people called him ugly for his big mustache basically, and other things as well. However, he was also a student of Schopenhauer, and if you don't know who Schopenhauer, even Nietzsche is for that matter, I'll just sort of like rewind a bit. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher that wrote in the 19th century, late 19th century. He wrote on nihilism, and he was a student of Schopenhauer, who himself was a philosopher who wrote on pessimism, as well as on the nature of life. Nietzsche has a lot of different books. He has books like Ecce Homo, The Gay Science, and Human Ought to Human. He's got plenty of books. He's a very good writer because he focuses on many different concepts. For example, one of his more famous concepts that has actually been abused, really, was his concept of Übermensch, or Superman. basically, since we don't want slave morality anymore, the slave morality of Christianity and religion, and that humanity now must take upon themselves and cast off this slave morality and create their own morality, or what he calls, and become the Übermensch, or the Superman in German. Friedrich Nietzsche is also influential on his views towards not only religion but also towards life, philosophy. But what I find interesting, what many people actually don't understand, and what really Alain de Bouton really highlighted this for me, is that many people mistake Nietzsche for being a pessimist. They consider his writings on nihilism, for example, as being indicative of him actually endorsing the philosophy. And for all those of you who don't know what nihilism is, it's a philosophical position whereby there's this emphasis on accepting chaos and disorder, and accepting that there's no meaning in life and that there's no direction in life. And that's sort of like the gist of nihilism. And Nietzsche actually rejected this philosophy. He accused Christianity and different religions of heading towards this philosophy of nihilism. And he was a student of Schopenhauer, and he did actually adopt a lot of Schopenhauer's perspectives towards pessimism and towards how you could say the attitudes towards life. But if you read in one of his books, Untitled Meditations, and by the way, this Consolations of Philosophy really introduced me to Nietzsche's writing, and really it was a gateway for me, and that's why I find it a very important gateway for me to be introduced to the man of Nietzsche's life. Because in the chapter on suffering, Alain de Bouton goes through Nietzsche's perspective on the cultivation of suffering, so how Nietzsche differed from other of his peers at the time. A lot of people at the time were writing, especially Christian writers, were writing that, it's a part of God's will that men suffer, or that you have to, if you will, run away from your suffering, or run away from the troubles of your life. Nietzsche was different. He sort of argued for the opposite. He said that you have to confront your sufferings. You've got to confront your struggles and cultivate suffering, like you cultivate a garden, essentially. And you learn to master the challenges that the world has thrown at you, and with these challenges you learn how to become a better man and a better individual. And that's the gist of Nietzsche's work, is that you find value, you find meaning, you find strength in that suffering, in that heartache of life. In that way, and this is why people sometimes think that, okay, Nietzsche did say that, you're going to embrace suffering, therefore he must be a nihilist, but actually he wasn't. He was an optimist, I would call him. I would actually say maybe I would say that he's an optimist. He had a despite all of his hard life, and Alain de Bouton mentions his whole life, the heartache he experienced throughout it. He mentions, and he illuminates actually, how very strangely, almost stoic-like, and this returns to the theme of stoicism, of this whole, I guess, these books that have a relation to one another. It's this attitude, really, that you can handle the struggle of life, that you should not run away from your struggles, that you have to, or you should actually embrace them. You should embrace the issues and not run away from them. Therefore, you can actually tackle them in the future. That's really the aim of cultivating suffering. I mean, it is sad to know that Nietzsche actually succumbed to most likely some form of degenerative form of syphilis during his time at a brothel. He never got it treated, and that developed, of course, into a mental illness, in which he broke down actually in a horse in Turin in Italy, and because he was actually crying at how the owner was essentially lashing this horse, and Nietzsche, while on his usual schedule of walking up a hill and about to walk up a hill, he saw this horse getting hit by its master, and he threw up his hands and held the horse and pushed away the master, and he had a complete mental breakdown. And for the last 10 years of his life, unfortunately, he was completely bedridden. He had gone insane. He died actually of, like, essentially, we speculate now today, he died of the degenerative form of syphilis that caused mental illness if not treated. It's a tragedy, his whole entire life. But the reason why I find him and Consolations of Philosophy an important book is it fundamentally opened my eyes to the beauty of philosophy and the importance of philosophers like Nietzsche in understanding how to handle life, especially as a young man, as a young person. Because it's very hard to be yourself when others are essentially manipulating or coercing you, really, into being the same or to being as others do. And I think that's actually, a lot of people essentially experience peer pressure, or they don't know how to handle a lot of these hurdles that are thrown to them throughout their life. And and I think that's honestly that was a book that really did help me, and I really recommend it for anyone, because it's a very important book. I think it's a book that I recommend every young person to read at least once in their life. Okay, that's the second book. So the second book was by Alain de Bouton, and it's called The Consolations of Philosophy. The first book was Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. The second book was Alain de Bouton's Consolations of Philosophy. The third book actually comes from a scientist. His name is Alan Lightman. I call him a scientific poet. He wrote a book called Einstein's Dreams in the early 90s. It's a novelization of Einstein's musings and his dreams while writing his theory of special relativity in Switzerland in the early 1920s. The book takes as I said, you could say a creative fiction approach, whereby you have each chapter dedicated to some form of dream that Einstein, or the character of Einstein, has about time. And what I like about this book, and what I found very fascinating about this book, and I read this book when I was about, what was I? Probably 16 as well, 16, 17. I actually found this book next to another book that I'll mention actually a bit later. And it's a very short book, very small book, filled quite interestingly with very interesting writing, I would say. Like, you have the writer engaging really in a poetic form of prose. And Alan Lightman, who himself is a physicist, he's actually I think he's a theoretical physicist. Well, I can't remember, theoretical physicist or experimental physicist. But anyway, he works on things like, what's the thing that last time he was working on? He's working, I guess, on the theory of small, or like, quantum mechanics, I think. That's one of the things, not quantum mechanics or special relativity, one of the two. And this book really comes out of his fascination with Einstein and his writings at the time when he was writing his theory of special relativity in the early 1920s in Switzerland. So this book really takes the perspective of Einstein and what he would dream about regarding time. And what I find beautiful about the book is that the book has different, how you can say, aspects of time. And I'm going to just bring up some quotes from the book, so just give me some time. But thank you for all those of you who are still joining me. I'm just this is a casual stream for those of you who just joined. It's not meant to be too serious. I'm just going through books that I find actually interesting. And I just want to share these books with you, so I'm going to continue now. Now, Alan Lightman, he wrote Einstein's Dream in the early 90s, I believe. And in the book, as I mentioned before, you have each chapter dedicated to a different notion of time. A different notion of time. So in one chapter, it will be about what if time was a circle? Or what if time had no end? What if people had immortality? And there are some very interesting phrases in this book that I actually highly enjoy and highly recommend. It's just the way that Alan talks about time in each chapter. So imagine if you could never die, basically. You had immortality, okay? And you could never die. What would you do? And now you may think that's a positive thing. However, Alan Lightman puts it on its head. He says, okay, what if you understood that you could never escape the shadow of your father, or escape the shadow of his father, and their father, and all the generations onward, all looking on you, all, never being quiet, never being allowing you to be free, essentially. That's the whole purpose of these chapters. They're just really to illuminate a different understanding of time. And what I like about the book is just how it's written, the flow of the writing, the beauty of the writing. I'm going to try my best finding some quotes from it, but I'm going to go quickly on Goodreads. Okay, I think it's from Einstein's Dreams. Just give me some time. It's a very short book as well. So, for example, the tragedy of this world is that no one is happy, whether stuck in a time of pain or of joy. The tragedy of this world is that everyone is alone. For life in the past cannot be shared with the present. Each person who gets stuck in time gets stuck alone. So that's another example of the writing in the book regarding one chapter about time. Now, I always like the saying, suppose time is a circle bending back on itself. The world repeats itself precisely, endlessly. This kind of writing really inspired me to start writing when I was about 16. It allowed me to play around with different concepts and different syntaxes, or different ways of phrasing things. Like when I started writing at about 16, 17 for philosophy, this stuff of magic, I started writing on philosophy. I mostly focused on Socrates first and foremost, but the things I would read really impacted on what I would write. So if I was reading something by Plato, I would write something about Socrates. Yes, the writing was pretty awful. I now look at it, back at it. But I had to start somewhere, because unfortunately you can't just assume that you're going to be good when you first start off. I mean, most times you're going to be awful. I mean, the whole notion that you somehow are born or are born with certain talents and that is bullshit. Most of the things you want, if you want good skills, you need to work at them. It's the truth. That's the hard truth of the matter, is that if you want to be good at something, you have to work at it. And that's going to involve a lot of rising and falling. You've got to have really a stoic-like attitude towards any endeavor that you pursue, whether it be writing or filmmaking or just any task. You just have to have the persistence, that determination to keep on going, even when no one is cheering you on or when no one gives a shit. That's the most important time where you have to go on for yourself, essentially. To get back to Alan Lightman, what I find touching about the book is it taught me really how beautiful writing can be, how poetic dry subjects can be, how poetic time can be. You may think, if you read, for example, I've read a bit of Einstein's Special Relativity, and I can tell you that the mathematics and stuff I do not understand whatsoever, and the writing is beyond me, but I have it in my collection just as a sort of a point of reference if I want to see how Einstein wrote. He wrote, of course, many different things, because if anyone knows Einstein's life and that, they know that he wrote a lot of letters, and he actually was quite the intellectual. He was not just a mathematician or a theoretical physicist. He was really a shiny beacon of light in his time. But all the stuff that he did, he worked hard at. He persisted at. He tried his best, and he failed constantly, but still, he got through. And that's what I find interesting. In the book, it really shows you that you can take the most dry of subject matters, such as time, and you can really show the reader how very fleshed out and how beautiful these concepts can be. How amazing a concept like time. Remember, like if time was a circle going back on itself, or if you could live forever, would you? And it really flips those really positive outlooks that you may have on such concepts like the notion of immortality, as I mentioned. And when you have that kind of concept of understanding, a concept of just learning, really, you'll never actually find yourself in a boring state, because you'll always find that even the driest of subject matters can be interesting. I think that's another thing that I learned, is just how you can teach such complex topics and make them palpable to the rest of your readership. Yeah, the thing is, thank you, by the way, Ray. This, for those of you who just joined, it's just a casual stream over here. I'm just talking about books that I enjoy and books that have influenced me, and so I'm taking my time this time, because I think I've rushed with a lot of other streams because I felt a bit pressured. So if you have a question, please leave it by the side on the chat, and I'll answer it at the end of the stream. But at the moment, I've talked about so far 3 books. I've talked about Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, how it taught me lessons of how to endure struggle and how to view the oppressor and the oppressed. Second book I covered, of course, was Alain de Bouton's Consolations of Philosophy, and how it introduced me to philosophy and introduced me to philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, and the ability and strength of being able to to be able to face struggle, in other words. Third book I covered was Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, which really showed me the beauty really of writing, and how beautiful writing can be, as well as really introduced me to educating people on the value of discussion with people. The fourth book I now turn to is a classic, and I think everyone has at least heard of it or has at least read it, and it's, of course, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. I think it's one of the books that is read actually by General Mattis, James Mattis, of former Secretary of Defense for the United States, recently resigned in late 2018. But he's and me sort of have both read, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. For those of you who don't know who Marcus Aurelius is or was, he was one of the philosopher emperors of Rome. He's actually was one of the good emperors, like they would call him. He was a man who actually he sort of was inspired by Epictetus's discourses. And for those of you who don't know who Epictetus is, Epictetus was a slave. Actually, he was born a slave, but became a free man after a while. And he wrote the foundation, besides Zeno, of Citium, of Stoicism. And the discourses had really inspired Marcus Aurelius. It's actually, if you read the introduction to Marcus Aurelius' Meditations by translators and actually academics, they actually mention the fact that Marcus Aurelius was heavily inspired by Epictetus's discourses. And the discourses, I've only listened to part of it on audiobook. By the way, a lot of these books you can actually find on audible.com, and this is, of course, a free plug for audible.com, or you can even find them on YouTube if you Google them. Because a lot of these books are well known, and a lot of these books have already people who have read them out loud. I know, for example, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and Epictetus's The Discourses have actually been read out on YouTube that you can find for free. They are a couple hours, but if you don't want to really read the painstaking task of reading each page one by one, and honestly, I understand when people in this fast-paced world can't really get to reading nowadays. I mean, for me, myself, I usually only read small articles nowadays, but I listen, of course, to historical podcasts and different podcasts on different writers, different philosophers, and different books, as well as audiobooks. So when it comes to the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, this book was written not for anyone. It was only really a personal diary of Marcus Aurelius's. It consists, I believe, of 9 books. I probably could be wrong on that. Probably 9 or 10 books. I can't for the life of me remember. But each book really is a journal entry. We'll just call that a journal entry from Marcus Aurelius' time on his campaign. And it's really his thoughts on the world, and his thoughts on nature, and on value, and on society, and on the reality of mortality, I think. Because a lot of people kind of fail to realize that there's going to come a time when me and those who listen to me, as well as those who will listen to the future at the moment, will cease to be, and what will be left is only memories that are held by loved ones until those too perish with the die of time. And it's this kind of attitude that Stoicism, and because Marcus Aurelius was really, we could say, one of the most, you could say the poster boys really for Stoicism, especially virtue ethics, that kind of lifestyle of Stoicism. It's more of these practical aspects of Stoicism. That's what he's well known for, essentially. And when it comes to Marcus Aurelius and his meditations, in the meditations, he has different chapters dedicated to his perceptions on the universe, his perceptions on life and courage, his perceptions on the human soul, his perceptions on religion, his perceptions on strength, and really he embodies the Stoic philosopher, because as I mentioned before earlier with Stoicism is that given the nature of Stoicism, it's a philosophy really of trying to control your emotions. At the end of the day, you're trying to control the weaker, more irrational side of your humanity. A Stoic always aims to be a rationalist at the end of the day, to always have, to make sure that his faculties control his direction, and to be able to weather the storm of each difficulty by accepting the notion that you're a part of the universe and the universe is a part of you. It's almost this kind of cosmic perspective, to put it that way. And the cosmic perspective is echoed by scientists like Carl Sagan, and is echoed by other people subsequent to Carl Sagan, whereby it's this understanding that you are not in control of grander things in life. So, for example, when it comes to war or poverty or something like that, those bigger issues where you may feel that you can do something about them, but in reality, and this is the sort of Stoic perspective, these things are out of your control, and therefore should not be worried about too much. And what the Stoic aims to do is to control that which can be controlled, so such as a good body or good discipline, things that can be controlled. The Stoic aims to improve and aims to make efficient. And those that they cannot improve, what they aim to do is simply to acquire the faculties to have that vision of the world whereby they can tolerate it or they can actually face it. However, there has been arguments among Stoic philosophers, especially the more, we could say them de facto interventionist kind of Stoic philosophers, where you have, I remember reading even the introduction of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations by one of the academics, and for the life of me I can't remember, and I think it's Simon Blackburn, I can't remember, but anyway, he actually said that for Marcus Aurelius, for example, he wanted to actually essentially try and make the try establish the parameters for, you could say, a Stoic vision of society. He wanted to make sure that people were actually able to learn about how to face suffering and how to face death and all these kind of things. And what he did from that is that he kind of like he forwarded this vision during his campaigns as emperor during his time at Rome. And what I find particularly inspiring about Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations, and I'm going to look up some Marcus Aurelius wiki quotes. Sorry about that. Yeah, come on, hold on a second. So for example, there's quotes like this from Book 2. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. So you have some of those kind of lessons. But there's one quote that I really want to mention. I'm just trying to find it. And it really highlights the kind of the cosmic perspective of the Stoic. So it's from book number, I think it's book number 4, and it goes like this. Constantly regard the universe as one living being, having one substance and one soul, and observe how all things have reference to one perception, the perception of this one living being, and how all things act with one movement, and how all things are the cooperating causes of all things which exist. Observe, too, the continuous spinning of the thread and the contexture of the web. To translate into English, you're a part of the universe and the universe is part of you. That's the kind of what it really boils down to at the end of the day. The thing about it is that it boils down fundamentally for the Stoic is that they are intrinsically a part of nature, and nature isn't part of them. And everything has providence, if you will. Everything has been determined by nature to be as it is. And things that are out of your control, you need only sort of like adapt and react to that circumstance. So they, in many ways, they're like determinists. They believe that everything in nature is already determined by some form of a superior being. And they're more like, they really come off as a pandeist or pantheists. In other words, they believe that God is nature, nature's them essentially as well. So they are a part of nature. Nature is God at the end of the day. So like this is what Stoics kind of believe, at least the ancient Stoics of Marcus Aurelius and other such people like him. And what I found important about this book, what this book did for me when I was about 17, is I remember still very vividly laying on the trampoline outside my house, in the backyard of my house, looking at the stars and reading passages like that, thinking that, and this is at a time where it was very important for me. I was still coming really to the age of reason and really trying to discover myself. I found it quite important to look at the stars and to look at myself and to understand that what I am looking at is the stars of thousands of suns, each that have already given out, that are only memories in the sky. Because if you know anything about science, we understand that light takes a long time to get to us, and most of the stars you see at night actually are dead, basically. And one day the stars will go out, essentially. Not now, but sometime soon, because that's how relativity works. That's how light works. So I'm looking at myself and I'm understanding that the stars that I see are mere memories left over from the universe, really, as reminders to myself. And it reminded me of Marcus Aurelius's words that I remember. Just hold on a second. Aurelius. There's one specific quote that I really enjoy from him. I'm just gonna try bring it up. So it goes like this: the memory of everything is very soon overwhelmed in time. That's sort of like, that really just sums up the attitude that one must have, is that the universe you see at night, the stars you see at night, they are just relics of the past, and that you yourself, you are a part of this universe, as Sagan put it, and you are the universe, but the universe is also you. In other words, you're a fundamental part of the nature of life, and that the memories that you leave behind will be the stars for your loved ones or your friends, and those stars will eventually fade, as do the memories of many people fade with time, and that's okay, that you should not be afraid of that you should take value in the life you have right now, and value every single precious moment that you have to be able to live. And should death come, then welcome it, for death is natural. It's a natural process of life. Doesn't mean just fully go on and cheer it on. It means more have that attitude to not fear death or to not fear such things. So that's really what kind of inspired me about Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and what still stays with me. And I still return to that book, and I actually understand why General James Mattis likes that book as well. It's a very important book that I wish more people have the time to read. It's a very short book, or just the time to really reflect on. And sad for Marcus Aurelius, who died actually on the battlefield. He never intended his work to be sort of like seen by anyone. He never intended it to be published. He never intended any of it to come out. It was him dealing or grappling with ideas in his head. Basically, it's a book for himself. It's writings for himself. It's only because his servants, essentially, and the people who came after him said, okay, we should actually produce this work and put it together and publish it, that we have it today, and thankfully we do. As we do with plenty of other people like Epictetus's The Discourses. So, to give a brief recap, before I mention the fifth book. So we've gone through Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. We've gone through Alain de Bouton's The Consolations of Philosophy. We've gone through Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, and we've gone through Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The fifth book that I want to mention is actually a very important book that still is one of my favorite books to this day. And it's by the author Christopher Hitchens, and it's called Letters to a Young Contrarian. It was published in 2001, 2002, I believe. I think it's 2001. Now, Letters to a Young Contrarian, for those of you who don't know, was written actually as a response to a request that he was doing for a university, which was writing on different aspects, like on law, on poetry, and Christopher Hitchens, who at the time was a polemicist, orator, and journalist, first and foremost. He wrote this book as a response, really, to his students. Like, it was meant for his students. At the time that he was teaching, it was meant for his students to listen to. So that's Letters to a Young Contrarian. What he did is he wrote this book for his students, and it's actually based, the title Letters to a Young Contrarian is based off the title of Alan Rickman's, I think, book called Letters to a Young Poet. And he mentions that in his book. And what the book is really, it's a sort of like a series of letters, essentially what it is, letters. I think about 10 letters, each consisting of different topics, different life lessons for students and different life lessons for teens, which I found very interesting, actually very important. I think it's one of Chris Hitchens' best books he has ever written, and that's saying something. For me, for example, I've read a lot of Chris Hitchens. I've actually read almost all of his works. And I can tell you that this book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, is probably one of the best books that he has ever written in his life. And I honestly think that it's a criminal punishment, basically, that not many people actually know about or have even heard of it. But anyway, let me sort of explain to you why it's good, why you should pick it up and read it. I actually picked up this book when I was about in 2014, so about 17, 18. Small book. I remember actually getting it from Viva Books at the time, which is a bookstore in Australia, and actually turning through its pages and sitting down and reading this book cover to cover within the span of 3 hours. The book starts off with an account of the Dreyfus Affair. And for those of you who don't know the Dreyfus Affair, it was an affair that rocked the heart of France in the late 19th century. It involved a man by the name of Adolphus Dreyfus, who was accused of treason after giving allegedly secrets to, at the time, the Prussian government. This was his accusation. It was the accusation brought against Dreyfus. However, a lot of the tabloid papers at the time accused Dreyfus of not only being a traitor, but also of being a Jew. As if being a Jew, because at the time, anti-Semitism was quite rife in lots of Europe. And the Dreyfus Affair really sparked open a huge anti-Semitic wave, We had people protesting against just not only Alfred Dreyfus being a traitor, but quote-unquote him being a Jew, as was mentioned. And Christovich notes the Dreyfus Affair, and then he notes, most importantly, Emilia Zola. And Emilia Zola, for all of those of you who don't know, Emilia Zola was a very famous French novelist. And he actually took the side of Dreyfus. He wrote a bunch of letters, which I also recommend. Anything you can get letters by Dreyfus. So not letters by Zola, and has brilliant letters on to the youth, letters to the old, letters to the present. His most famous defense of Dreyfus, in which he wrote actually a defense of Dreyfus, he called it j'accuse, or I accuse, and he accused the French government of being cowardly towards their handling of the Dreyfus Affair, which they were. They were cowardly because they allowed an innocent man. Hold on a second. I think we may have a little bit of a connection issue. Hold 1 second. Okay. Okay, sorry for that. We had interruption a bit. I'm back again. But anyway, the Dreyfus Affair. What do you mean? What? Why is this? Okay, that's not. Hold 1 second. Sorry for all those of you listening. I'm just having technical issues at the moment for some unbeknownst reason. Okay, I'm back. I should be back. Okay. So, the Dreyfus Affair really rocked the whole of France, as it involved essentially an innocent man having his reputation burnt by not only the media but also the government, who failed to do anything to stop Dreyfus, basically. Failed to prove Dreyfus's innocence. So, what happened is that why is this thing not working? Sorry, for some reason it's like glitching. I don't know why, but it just is. It's glitching at the moment. It should be okay now, hopefully. I don't have anything on at the background. No, everything's good. Okay, sorry. I'll try to finish what I was saying. This affair rocked the whole of France, because it put the innocence of a man on trial. For what? For simply being a Jew. That was sort of the gist of the whole affair, is that he was not only being accused of being a traitor, but he was being scapegoated for the treachery on the basis that he was a Jew. And it actually sparked a whole actually movement. It actually sparked the Zionist movement that came afterwards by Theodor Herzl. He actually wrote The Jewish State. Theodor Herzl founded the first Zionist Congress because he was so shocked by the treatment of Alfred Dreyfus that he actually formed a Zionist movement and helped establish the Zionist movement for the State of Israel, where he established the principles of what a Jewish state should be, and so on and so forth. So now, back to the Dreyfus Affair. So in this, in the letters to a young Contrarian, in the first letter, he actually accounts on how Dreyfus and how Zola were treated for their defense of basically not only their defense of liberty, but their defense of the man himself. Like, Zola appealed to the youth. He said, why, youth, please do not act like we, the elderly, are doing. Do not be bigoted. Do not hate your other person. And what the whole point of the first letter is to inspire people to understand that, there's a lot of people who have had to face a huge lot of difficulties in the minority, and that just because the numbers are against you does not mean that you cannot continue through, that you cannot actually win at the end of the day. Because we all know what happened after the Dreyfus Affair is Alfred Dreyfus was actually pardoned. He was actually had a formal apology given by the French government for his treatment once they found out the true traitor, who was not Dreyfus. Emilia Zola was also pardoned, and he was also actually respected after about a decade or two later. But the point of the matter is that that whole affair highlighted how much fear and bigotry can make people do the most stupid of things. That's the first letter. The other letters deal with different, similar sort of aspects of life and of history of different people. Deals with Nelson Mandela. It goes through what the beauty of writing can do, how it's important to write, how it's important to read. He goes through all these things. He goes through just different life lessons. He doesn't do it condescendingly like a lot of self-help books usually do. He doesn't do it condescendingly. He does it with a respect to the student, first and foremost. He respects the student as if he was respecting his own son. Like, yes, there's this level of respect that you have throughout the book, and it's very interesting as well. Like, I'll read you a section of extract of it. Hold on a second. By the way, you guys can put your questions in the box, because I will answer them a bit later after I've done this. So please, if you have questions, please oh, thank you, Mr. Daniel Andreoni. I love you too. Okay, so there's a very interesting. Okay, so I'm trying to find a good quote. This one's interesting. Okay, so this is my favorite. Beware the irrational, however seductive. Shun the transcendent, and all who invite you to subordinate or annihilate yourself. Distrust compassion. Prefer dignity for yourself and others. Don't be afraid to be thought arrogant or selfish. Picture all experts as if they were mammals. Never be a spectator of unfairness or stupidity. Seek out argument and disputation for their own sake. The grave will supply plenty of time for silence. Suspect your own motives and all excuses. Do not live for others any more than you would expect others to live for you. This comes from, I think it's one of the last, I think it's the 9th letter in the book. But it helped me as a writer to be more inspired in writing. Because the principle of take the side of the victim, aid them in their struggle, has really stood with me. That you have to have the courage, regardless of the numbers against you. You have to have the ability to have the strength to persist despite every single obstacle that's weighing down on you. That's the most important thing that you have to learn, is to be your own self, to be happy with yourself, to have power in yourself, to not rely heavily on others, to not depend on others for confirmation of who you are, but to instead rest on your own shoulders, to reflect and refine who you are as a person, and thus develop a better individual and better character over time. So I think that's what really the Letters to a Young Contrarian taught me. It taught me the value of being yourself, and the value of writing, and becoming your own person, the better version of yourself, the best version of yourself as much as possible to do. And unfortunately, it goes back to my first point that I mentioned, that just like almost an hour ago, that a lot of people want to fit in, a lot of people want to be the same. They don't want to rock the boat, they don't want confrontation, they don't want any of that. They want an easy life. Just an easy life, where things are given to them, where they don't have to struggle. It's a no, you could say it's a somewhat something that you could aspire to, but the fact of the matter is that what makes life interesting is getting up every time you fall. What makes life interesting is being able to persevere when everyone was against you. What makes life worth living, really, is to find that purpose and meaning, and to create that purpose and meaning through testing yourself, through tests of your character, by being able to stand on your principles, the principles that you have developed, to be able to learn to be the better version of yourself. That's the beauty, that's the importance, really, of being yourself, and the importance of just standing up for yourself. And I think I learned that actually from Chris Hitchens, and he was a big inspiration actually on my writing ability. And so to give a recap, we first covered Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, the value of facing oppression, the value of becoming the better man, and essentially having the persistence to persevere through your heartache, through your obstacles, and to realize that the journey is not yet over. You have one hill more to climb, but for the moment, lift your head to the sky and bask in the glory of the sun when you're on top of that hill. But remember to keep on going, and that comes from Nelson Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom. The second book that we covered was Alain de Bouton's Consolations of Philosophy. That introduced me to different philosophers, specifically Nietzsche. The value of having an attitude of cultivating suffering and not throwing it away, becoming optimistic despite the otherwise pessimistic environment that you're in, to sort of build your character. That sort of introduced me to the value of philosophy and the value of philosophers and the value of reading philosophy. Third book was by Alain Lightman, and it's Einstein's Dreams. Highlighted the beauty of poetry and poetic writing, the creativity that one can have with the most dry of subjects, and the ability to actually communicate in a very artistic and unique way a topic that otherwise people would find dry if I communicate in another way. The fourth book, of course, is from Marcus Aurelius, and it was Meditations. Taught me the value of understanding my place in the universe and understanding the nature of the universe, and to learn that inner calm, that sense of place in this grand, vast universe. It taught me the value of Stoicism as philosophy as well. And the fifth book that I covered was Christopher Hitchens' Letters to a Young Contrarian, which taught me the value of being yourself and the value of standing up for your own principles, building your own character to become the best version of yourself. These are the 5 books that I would recommend all of you to at least either read or to read again, because these books have touched my life and have influenced me in a way that I honestly can say I would have never been influenced by if I had not read these books, because it gave me the keys and the tools and opened me up to so many different books by so many different authors from so many different epochs. I learned the value of essentially being curious, to always wanting to learn something new, to never wanting to be accepting of just what is given to me, just always being curious to learn. The thirst for knowledge, that thirst for knowledge. To be able to reflect, to have introspection, in other words. To understand the value of knowledge and the development of knowledge with experience to your character. That's the thing that I've learned from these books that I can recommend. Maybe you may not learn the same lessons, as no one really learns the exact same lessons from each book, because we all have different interpretations at the end of the day. But fundamentally, I say to you, if you have 5 books like what I've mentioned right now, ask yourself, are those 5 books, were they beneficial to you? Did they develop your character? Can you say to people who are near you, can you tell them about these books? Because that's the beauty of spreading this knowledge, because at the end of the day, you can find all these books online. You can find them on PDF version. I mean, you can get a physical copy from the library, or a physical copy. You can get an audio book. These are books that are important for people to have. Now, that's the 5 books I wanted to recommend that are the most important books of my life. Now, I'm just going to go to some other books, really. So you probably have noticed, this is going to be a bit more free-handed, essentially. You probably have noticed on the screen a couple of slides going by, and most of them have been people that you may know or you may not know. One of the people, of course, is Raif Badawi, as seen over here with Free Raif. Raif Badawi is a Saudi blogger, actually, who was arrested in 2012 for dissident writing against the Saudi regime. and he was actually given a lashes, essentially, and he's still in prison to this day, but he wrote a book called 1,000 Lashes, and I recommend that you read it because it's actually a collection of his blogs, and it was written during the time of the early 2012, 2013. It's covers things like the Arab Spring. It covers things like the uprisings in places like Tunisia. It also covers Islamism as well. You can learn a lot of things from Raif Badawi, so I do recommend that you read his book, and actually, hopefully one day he will be freed by the Saudi regime. Another book for all of those of you who are more into stuff like ancient Greek or ancient Roman history or philosophy, there's books such as Herodotus's Histories, Herodotus being the first historian. He wrote he did actually wrote one of the first oral accounts of the Peloponnesian Wars, and first oral accounts of his adventures around at the time, the modern world, which included Asia Minor, parts of North Africa, and of course just west of Asia Minor in Greece and that. So it's very interesting to look at that. If you also want to look at maybe like the Peloponnesian War in general, look at Thucydides' The History of the Peloponnesian War. That's also a good one. You can also look at Xenophon's Hellenica, which is the history of our times, and that's also about the Peloponnesian War. It's both of them are good books. They're a bit stale, arguably, but they're very important, I guess, for understanding of that war and that period of time specifically. If you want to actually look at, or if you're interested to know, you could also look at Julius Caesar's writings on Gaul. He wrote actually a lot on Gaul and on different. I never knew this, but Julius Caesar did write. The famous Roman emperor. He did write, and he actually has very interesting thoughts on the Gauls and that. If you're looking for more philosophy, there's plenty of philosophers you can pick up. For example, I picked up, basically you can probably tell, but the philosophy that I've adopted usually over time has been Stoicism and existentialism. I've adopted Stoicism from people like Marcus Aurelius and to a lesser extent Nelson Mandela, even though himself, I would think that he would not consider himself a Stoic philosopher, but again, the stuff he preaches is almost like it's Stoic-like. That's what you can do. You can also look at people like Karl Popper, like on the screen. He wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, a very important book on totalitarianism and the need for free speech. You can look on these also Conjectures and Refutations. He actually goes into quite a lot of detail into his theory of falsification. Falsification, for all of those who don't know, it's essentially that part of the scientific method by which, in order for a theory to have strength in it, it should be able to be proven wrong. So, for example, if you say that all geese are white, it would only take one white geese to disprove that statement. So that's what falsification is. And Conjectures and Refutations, he actually goes and dissects why, for example, Marxism can never be considered scientific, because it actually can't be falsified, because the goalposts always shift, essentially, for the Marxists and that. That's one also a good book. If you're looking for more feminist type readers, I would say, you have to go for people like who wrote what's the book again? Marjane Satrapi. She wrote Persepolis. Very good book on the story of a young Iranian woman growing up in France and the disconnect between the more religious part of her life and the more secular part of France's life. It's a very good book. Very good for young people as well. If you're looking for something more, I think more fiction-esque, then of course I would recommend to you, as I've always sort of recommended to people, I would recommend to you Lord of the Rings from J.R.R. Tolkien, or even Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, because those books have their own lessons, essentially. Again, Alan Lightman's book, Einstein's Dreams, is also good on that part. When it comes to actual, I've got a lot of books in my head that have just gone past. If you're looking for more modern writers, if you want to look at more of a scientific, sort of like a scientific philosophy-esque kind of style of writing, I would recommend Carl Sagan's The Pale Blue Dot and Demon Haunted World, because Carl Sagan's actually a brilliant communicator. He was a brilliant communicator, and he's dissection of dissection of anti-climate change deniers, and his dissection of people who believed in pseudoscience and superstition is very actually interesting and very detailed as well. That I really would recommend people to actually read. The Pale Blue Dot is a beautiful testimony to humanity and its place in the universe on this pale blue dot suspended in a sunbeam. Very good to read that as well. If you're more into people like from the Enlightenment era, you could always read, for example, Voltaire, as on the screen over here. He wrote the Philosophical Dictionary as well as Candide. He was a satirist, and Candide's actually a very funny book. It's on satire of aristocratic lifestyle. If you want, you could also read David Hume's on the Treatise of Human Nature. David Hume, of course, being an empiricist philosopher. He wrote a lot on empiricism, as well as being himself a kind of like a de facto historian as well. If you want, you could also read, of course, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That gives you the foundations of sort of like capitalism, essentially. It gives you a detail of mercantilism as well. Very interesting, very important books, really, for anyone. If you want other books from that era, you could read Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason and the Rights of Man. Very, very important books. On another front, I'm just thinking of other books I can recommend. There's so many different types of books, I tell you. Like, I've read a lot of books, and sometimes I have to just like jolt my memory. I also recommend reading James Baldwin's The Fire in Our Time. Fire in This Time, I think that's what they're called, by James Baldwin. He was a civil rights activist as well as a black grey writer in the 50s and 60s. A very passionate individual. Actually, his prose are very passionate. His prose remind me of Christopher Hitchens. He's a very good orator as well. A very good speaker as well. He's one of my top writers I read. You could also, of course, read Emma Goldman on anarchism and other writings. Emma Goldman being, of course, an anarchist writer, British writer, I think, if I can remember, British or German, one of the two. Been a while since I've read her works. If you're looking for more, I would say, kind of like religious criticism, you could always go for the classic, new atheism of, like Sam Harris's The End of Faith, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. You could go for those pop books, really, if you want like a kind of like a dissection of religion, a more polemical, more rhetorical style of writing. It reminds me of Baron de Holbox, who was a baron in France, I believe. He wrote a book on nature as well, and he was an open atheist, basically, but because of him being a baron, he was not really condemned as much as other people will. I mean, David Hume was almost a closet atheist, actually, but he never got that far to professing it, because, of course, at the time, to be atheist was sort of like to be shunned in society. I mean, it is a bit like that nowadays, but it's not really as strong as it once was. But other than that, I'm just thinking about one last book before I actually turn over to questions. Oh yeah, Isaac Asimov. Oh, I love Isaac Asimov. If you read Isaac Asimov for science fiction, H.G. Wells and Isaac Asimov are brilliant on science fiction. H.G. Wells for The Time Machine and War and Worlds. They're very good books. Isaac Asimov for The Last Question and I, Robot. Those are probably some of his best works ever. These are very important writers as well, for their sort of like through the use of the story to highlight themes of technology and themes of fears towards technology and so on. So these have just been some of the writers that I've mentioned and I've read before, and some of the philosophers and statesmen as well. I'm open for questions now, so if anyone wants to ask me questions, please do. I'm just going to link again for people who haven't. I'm going to be asking questions. This was sort of like a casual stream. Come and ask questions. Come on, ask questions. So, yeah. Okay, come and ask questions. I'm open to the floor. Okay, so I think that when it comes to the stream, it was casual. Okay, it's meant to sort of like give something over here, because I've been a bit busy myself with assessment work and that, so I've not really had time per se to deal with making an actual full video this time around. So that's what I've been doing. So I will answer some questions in the chat. So hello to all those of you who are listening and who have tolerated my spiel for like the last nearly an hour and a half. I'm answering questions right now, so if you want to, you can message me or just put a little question down here. So we have a couple comments. The Walkhead says I'm here. Hello, Mr. Jammy Gaming. Hello, sir. Ray says, good stream so far. The breadth of knowledge Anthony has is always a wonder to see. Oh, thank you. I mean, I've just got a lot of time on my hands, I think, sometimes, and I just read sometimes like things that interest me. I've always been like that. Maximus the Great. What are the pros and cons of a unitary state versus a federal state? Now, I actually have a video of that coming out in tomorrow or the next day from that. But it boils down to this. A unitary state has centralized government. So it has what we would call, like, I'm just going to get my presentation slides out quickly, because I'm going to be using an actual full-blown like presentation on this like for tomorrow to the next day's video. Sorry about that. Okay, so from my understanding of federalism versus sort of like non-federalism or unitary state, is that a unitary state, for example, like France, it has its power centralized in the French government in Paris. Okay, and the French government has the ability to, if they want to, decentralize power at their own whim, if they so choose, and also to dissolve certain councils underneath the government's reign, basically. They are like a unitary state is a state where power and sovereignty is focused in one national institution, such as a parliament. This national institution delegates power at its own accord and can abolish any subnational entity under it. Majority of countries are unitary. So you have over, I think, about 70% of countries are actually unitary states, historically. So, for example, Iraq used to be a unitary state. Syria is a unitary state. UK is a unitary state. So on and so forth. And New Zealand is a unitary state. Where it differs to a federal state is that in a federal state, yes, you may have a federal government, i.e. in the case of the United States and Australia, that is based in a place like Washington, D.C. or in Canberra. However, you also have what is known as local governments. So each government let me back up a bit. When it comes to the United States and Australia, we have different federal regions. We have, for example, in Australia, we have Northern Territory, Australian Capital Territory, Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, Queensland, Tasmania, so on and so forth. Each of these areas has their own premier or own head, essentially, with their own little government. Okay, they have control over local laws, such as police laws, whereas the government in large, like the government based in Canberra or the capital, has control over the defence force and the direction of the state, basically. Whereas local governments have their own ability to operate freely. With unitary states, that's not the case at all. The government actually has to, if it wants to, has to levy certain power within itself, basically. So with unitary and federal states, you have centralization versus decentralization. Decentralization being when you're shifting the power away from the center, and centralization is when you're moving power to the center. So in the case of unitary states, especially the ones in Syria, is that power is concentrated in the government of Damascus. Okay, and this power is only divvied up when the government of Damascus wants it to, but it can abolish at any time any form of council structure like thing that can, I guess, designate power to the rest of the country. However, that's not the case in a federal government. In a federal government, you have different states, and different states have their own little power. So they've got their own little centers of power. So, for example, in Australia, you have the Western Australian government being led by the Premier, Mark McGowan. Okay, that government is based in Perth, which is the capital of Western Australia. It has control over its own police laws, own local laws, and it operates kind of codependently with their other states, essentially. But it kind of like operates on its own little thing. Like, it's not getting orders, essentially, all the time from Canberra. It's doing its own little thing. And what makes it different is that in a federal state, the only thing that the federal government, i.e. like the government in Canberra, has is it can essentially defend the state and implement the vision of the state, essentially, under the Australian Constitution. In America, that's sort of the same situation, except you guys have Washington, D.C., and you have things like state rights. So you have, for example, California being different to Texas. And the beauty of a federal state versus a unitary state is in a federal state you can actually experiment with a lot of things. So, for example, I believe in California you have legalized marijuana. That's not the case in places like Georgia or something like that. In other words, you can test out an experiment in one state because you have a notion of state rights. That would never happen under a unitary state, because under a unitary state, unless the central government is actually divvying out power to little tiny councils underneath it, that doesn't really happen all the time. So when it comes to federal government, is that you have these different states that are all united under one constitution, under one central government, essentially. I'm sorry, not central government, federal government. However, they all work sort of like dependent of one another, essentially. So California has its own government and so on and so forth. They all do their own local laws, test its own state laws, and the beauty of it is that you can experiment with a federal state. Okay, so that's the pros of a federal state. The pros of I guess you could say, a unitary state is that you can sort of skip the bureaucracy. You have more ability to implement policies faster because you don't actually have to go through the process of actually arguing with actual local states about whether or not they can implement this policy or that policy. So you actually have much more efficiency in terms of government. But by saying that, the cons of it is because there's so much quote-unquote efficiency, it's easy to take power. Basically, you take power in the central government in Damascus or in London or so on. You take power, and what will happen is essentially that you'll have essentially sole power, because that's how unitary states operate. Unitary states like France, for example, the same thing as well. Like, they may have a large focus on devolution, basically, which is by the way, if you don't know what devolution is essentially when power is distributed more, sort of divided up more towards local councils, and that's a part of a unitary state. Decentralization is part of a federal state. So decentralization means giving more power to states, essentially. Where that differs, for example, to a confederacy or confederal type of government is that, the Articles of Confederacy before America became a federation. The Articles of Confederacy, you had 13 colonies, essentially. They were only united together against Great Britain, essentially, against the enemy. So this was like a confederation. They still had their own local laws. They only were allied really for a common purpose, but they weren't under a federal government per se. Okay, that changed, of course, with the Federalist Papers and the changing of the system to a federation, whereby they had a capital. Okay, and this capital basically, and this has always been a debate between the states and the federal government, is that how much power does the states have and how much power does the federal government has, which is a con of, I guess, at the end of the day, essentially federalism. So confederalism, that's why you have concepts like democratic confederalism, which is a concept created by Abdullah Öcalan in his book Democratic Confederalism in the early 2000s, where his system was to have essentially you have your own municipalities working codependently of one another, where they are responsible for their own self-defense, responsible for their own civil council, and these organizations sort of work independently from one another. However, they're all united with this kind of this overall vision of what society should be, like democratic, essentially. So democratic, i.e. democratic confederalism. So that's one type of confederalism. You get different types of federalism. I mean, you could go down the list. I mean, you have things like, just put it off the top of my head. You can have executive federalism, where when each level of government's role within the governance of a state is negotiated and determined between the executives, or the federal balance is negotiated. So something like a parliamentary system usually has is that kind of thing going on. You have administrative federalism, when the central government is chief policymaker and provincial governments are tasked with implementing policy. You have things like dual federalism, when each level of government works independently from one the other, where each form autonomous but bound by the constitution of a state, as you have in America, and so on and so forth. So that's my spiel on what the pros and the cons of federalism and essentially federalism and a unitary state is. Okay. Come on. Is anyone gonna ask more questions? I'm waiting. Hello everyone, for those of you who've just joined. It was a casual stream on some important books worth reading. And I went through 5 books. Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, Alain de Bouton's Consolations of Philosophy, Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, and Chris Fitchin's Letters to Young Contrarian. So 5 books that I think everyone should actually read. So I'm answering questions now. If you have any questions, put them in the chat below. Other than that, I mean, I don't know much else to say. Okay, so... Okay, so another comment was, I have come to tell you how much I love... Oh, thank you, Daniel. Hope you're doing well back in Bustleton. Haven't been in Boston for ages. Okay. So, what else questions do I have? For myself, I guess. I would say that it's important that you at least can find these books online or, you know, at your local bookstore, I guess. But if there's no other questions, it's been like 93 minutes. I can take any questions, like, give about 5 minutes, but I think if there's nothing else to say, I mean, I'm just gonna log off, I guess. So I guess I'll make my closing then. So thank you for those of you who listened to me during this time. Thank you for taking the time out to actually listen and taking the time out to, you know, respond and to engage with the subject matter. It was a casual stream. Hopefully we'll do a bit more formal ones a bit later on. But this week has been a bit hectic. And, yeah, I mean, I've got nothing else to say. So this has been Anthony Avice Du Buisson. I am a South African-born freelance writer living in Australia. I write on politics, minority rights, philosophy and history. My area of interest is the MENA region with a specific focus on Kurdish issues. I'm a contributor to a number of online syndications, such as The Region, Areo Magazine, and the Jerusalem Post. Currently studying a Bachelor of Law and a Bachelor of Arts with a major in politics and international relations. You can find me at philosophyismagic.com, where I post, but you can also get in contact with me at Stoic Vibe, or at capital S, lowercase TOIC, capital V, lowercase IPER. On Twitter, you can also find me on Facebook as well at stoicphilosophyismagic.com. You can email me at anthonyavicedubuisson@gmail.com. And I hope you all have a good night, and thanks for tuning in, and